Thank you very much, Professor. Sadly, we are not decision makers, and we don't have extreme views. I think we will agree about many things, and that's why I decided to be a little bit provocative and a little bit cheeky, and I'll try to pretend to be a proponent of law and justice, the Polish ruling party. It's a hard job, says the president. Well, I can make it once a year. Right, the former president, Mr. Kwaśniewski, began, so my first question goes to him. Mr. President, this strategic autonomy of Europe, this problem, this issue, has become very clear even before the Russian attack on Ukraine. It was the American intelligence services that learned in a lot of detail what was going to happen. It was the Americans, not European intelligence service. Europe thought it was not really true. It was a pipe dream. Americans started sending weaponry to Ukraine. Americans are now making the decisions about what kind of armament should be sent. And Europe was 2 or 3 steps behind America. Is this our European autonomy? Is this our defense policy? Will it always be like a protectorate of the United States? I think these are pretty strong words, unnecessarily strong. This isn't a protectorate. We still live in an era that emerged after the Second World War, where we had 2 pillars of security in Europe. NATO was the main security pillar, and the vast majority of Western Europe belongs to NATO. And then there was the civilizational pillar, a commonality of values and development, and that was the EU, which naturally underwent all sorts of transformations in the meantime. So I would not be very dramatic about the fact that it's the US that plays the first fiddle in the NATO alliance, and that the Americans were best prepared to react to the Russian threat. By the way, I'm not fully convinced that the Americans only used their own intelligence sources. I'm pretty sure that intelligence cooperation within NATO was very important. Now, the Americans took on this pioneering war of informing the world about it. They hoped that maybe putting the cards on the table would act as a mitigating factor or deterrent for Putin. But I don't think it was only American intelligence sources. Now, I don't think this is a problem that we have this leading role of America. They are a cornerstone of transatlantic security, but the European component has to be strengthened, and that's it. I have used this argument in the past, and let me say it again. Even as we look at the changing preferences of the American voters, America might not be that interested in Europe anymore in the future. And there's a lot of influx of people from Latin America, for example, in the States. So naturally, over time, states will be looking more towards Americas rather than Europe. Future presidents might be of Latin American or maybe Chinese origin, and they might not have any Polish or Italian or British roots. So we have to bear that in mind, and while we must not give up on American leadership, we have to use this time to build the strategic autonomy in Europe. We can't afford to do it because we are no longer countries that have just emerged from the Second World War and are impoverished by it, or who have just come out of communism. We can do it, we can afford to do it, and this is something we have to do it, while at the same time strengthening the transatlantic ties. So autonomy hand in hand with those ties. And that will boost the safety and security of the EU. Now, about the reactions in the EU. Now, these are institutions that are reactive by nature. You have 27 member states, so it naturally takes time to reach a consensus. But if we want to be very critical about the EU, well, let's have a look at what really happened. Apart from Orban and Hungary, we are pretty unanimous in what we think. We have shown our unity to Russia, to Putin, and Putin wasn't expecting that. He was first time surprised by some European unity in 2014, but that was insufficient. And back then, yes, the criticism of what the European leaders did is correct, is right, because European leaders neglected and ignored many signals from Moscow back in 2014. This time, we have achieved a lot, but naturally, due to the democratic nature of the EU, often the reactions are slow to come, and it takes some time for them to be reached. Hopefully, this war will result in Europe understanding that this is a weakness. The European Union has specialized in overcoming crises, but the difference between the migration crisis and the financial crisis and this war is that there is less time to react, and the level of risk is much higher. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, President. I would now like to address Professor Pisarska, referring to what the professor said in his keynote speech, talking about an attempted European army from the 1970s. And we've been talking about the strategic autonomy. People say, if a state needs an army, then EU needs an army. Any structure like that has to have an army. Well, but if we do have a European army, why bother having NATO if we can get together, with an EU armed force? Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to the debate. Before I answer the question, let me emphasize the following. We have to realize that Europe is racing against time. All the assumptions that we had during the Cold War and then in the 1990s, all the reasons behind the growth and development of the EU are now disappearing. For example, being able to count on a regular, constant presence of the USA on the European continent. And I agree, we can no longer expect America to be an umbrella for Europe. Europe has to be able to defend itself. Secondly, what has changed is the global economy of an open world. As a result, in the 1990s, Europe became an economic tiger. We were the biggest common market in the world and the biggest player in the global economy. And here, our strength is on the wane as well. So it is necessary today, and this is something we talked about in the morning, it's necessary for us to be able to have our own causality, so to say. Now, we have this term, strategic autonomy, but that really is all about being able to act, having the capacity to act. For example, in response to crises that might appear, but also being able to shape our own policy forward. Here, there are three main challenges for Europe. First of all, we don't have a uniform vision of what Europe should be in the future. The Treaty of Rome created a vision of a common market, and we achieved it in the 90s. The Maastricht Treaty created the vision of a common currency and some basics of a security policy. Now, if I asked those of you who were born in the 1990s or later, and if I asked you, where is Europe headed? What is the vision for Europe in 10 years? What Europe would you like to have in 10 years' time as a young person? I'm not sure you'd be able to tell me what the vision is. Secondly, we don't have a strategic culture. We are unable to predict incoming crises. We only react to them. If a financial crisis appears, we do some fiscal policy. If there's a migration crisis, we strengthen the Frontex agency. If a health crisis appears, we work on the jabs that we need to deliver to the people. But we cannot predict these things. And finally, talking about strategic autonomy, it is also about values. Europe is only so strong, or to the extent of how we share common values. Many countries are responding with solidarity to Ukraine, not because they feel threatened by Russia. Portugal or Spain certainly don't feel threatened by Russia on an everyday basis. but we have the solidarity that stems from having common values. A democratic country has been attacked. Its territorial sovereignty has been taken away. Europeans do stand for law, order, and democracy. Now, if we don't share these values, and there are countries like Hungary who perceive the world differently, at least Orban's government looks at those values from an authoritarian point of view. So that makes this unity fragile. And these are the weaknesses that make it impossible to practically implement a strategic autonomy. Now, about a common army, the question that always rises is who is going to be willing to die for Europe? I think we don't need a European army. We need European empowerment for our militaries and to be able for the individual militaries to work together. And we can do it within NATO in collaboration with the EU. As a result of the war in Ukraine, I think there is less and less divergence in terms of defense between EU and NATO. Thank you. Professor, without wanting to be ironic, it seems we are taking our sweet time when thinking about strategic defense. The Euro Constitution was supposed to be an answer to that, but it turned out to be a flop in 2004. The Treaty of Lisbon was also supposed to regulate these issues. So we keep talking about it, and this still remains unresolved. While Russia had got stronger in the meantime, China has got stronger, and we keep talking. Why should this debate bring any results now if it had been failing for the past 20 years? Because there's a crisis, and a crisis is the main driving force for the development of the EU. It is not true the EU should be blamed for not predicting certain crises. Nobody saw the 2008 crisis coming. The COVID crisis, nobody saw it coming. We should have been able to predict that there would be a war in Ukraine. That's true. I'll grant you that. But not the other crises. Now, a crisis is a threat. Sometimes it's an existential threat to the EU. If you look from an academic point of view or from an American point of view, in a way, it's a miracle that the euro exists and that the EU is not falling apart. But that's a wrong way to approach this, and it's a very fundamental mistake. Euro exists because not having the euro would result in disastrous costs. And since this is the case, there is very strong political will to maintain and indeed to strengthen the euro. A very brilliant move was to create the European Central Bank. Economists who have been dealing with the euro decided that so long as the ECB exists, euro as a currency cannot fail. It is impossible for it to fail, and please remember this. Now, about when we're talking about strategic autonomy and about how the EU grows, well, yes, the EU reacts to crises. Most of them are black swans. Most of them, like Andrzej Koźmiński said, are unpredictable. So black swans are unpredictable by definition. Some of these swans are gray rather than black, and it would be nice to be able to tell them from the background, but it's difficult. Now, I won't be around anymore, I think, at a point in time when we will be able to talk about the United States of Europe. But what will emerge is islands of strengthened integration that will stem from future crises and our reaction to those crises. So the EU will become an archipelago of different activities that are similar between a bunch of countries, and hopefully it'll all work in line with each other. So whatever doesn't kill us makes us stronger, right? Well, people have been saying this is not true recently, but as far as the EU is concerned, yes, well, a crisis could kill us. Brexit is a very good example of that. I mean, everybody is saying, and everybody understands, that Brexit wouldn't have happened if not for active sabotage by Russia. That was done in all sorts of different ways. So the UK exiting the EU was a big blow, not just for Britain, also for the EU. You know, I love London, which I think is the greatest city in the world, but I'm less concerned about Britain than the EU, apart from Łódź in Poland.
Bardzo prosimy o interakcję w tym spotkaniu. Właśnie się zaczęły interakcje.
All right, so there's interaction from the floor. Very nice. Right, so yes, these crises bring about cost. I mean, a crisis doesn't just give you positive results, it can kill you. Thank you. President, Professor Belka has just referred to the issue of statehood. The EU is not a state, of course. It's an international organization. So at the end of the day, it doesn't have the competencies of a country, of a state. It only has the competencies that states have given it as part of the treaties. There's a lot of debate in the EU. We don't agree on everything. Can we change the treaties? It is not true that the EU doesn't have a state's competences. It does in a number of areas. And I don't think we are quarreling more than in the past. As a fact of the matter, I think we are quarreling less in the EU. Okay, so let's quarrel about that. We're a country that opposes certain policies in the EU very much. We are against integration. There's Hungary. There are a group of countries that are looking at Poland, looking at how else can we get some money from Brussels, how can they get some Brussels money hiding behind Poland's back. And then there's other countries of Europe that don't necessarily want to pay this money. I'm not very optimistic. You know, they've always been stealing money in the EU. We didn't invent this, you know. We were not even a member of the EU when Brussels was being milked for money, for example, by Greece, by the Spanish, by Portugal. You know, if you want to get from the south of Portugal to Lisbon, there are two motorways in parallel. You know, we don't have that sort of nonsense in Poland. There are two roads going along each other. Now, Portugal has reached a tremendous civilizational success, so things work out fine.
Yes, but we need to talk a bit about the essence of the EU, because the European Union, it's a long path. It's a reaction to two huge world wars. It's an attempt to create mechanisms that would allow us to avoid such wars in the future, to develop a trade economy and to lead to a unity, which seems to be the most difficult process. But it was made by the French, by the German, who were opponents in the main wars. Today we have also other challenges. For example, a Brexit, which was unnecessary. But we will not be discussing about Brexit now. We have a level of integration which is incomparable with what we had 10, 15, 20 years ago. And European Union is a special phenomenon, uncomparable. I could only compare it to the USA, or more than 200 years ago, the whole process. But that was completely different, and in a different social situation. Here we have a meeting of 27 member states, countless various languages, traditions and cultures. And this level of integration is getting stronger and stronger. In some areas, EU is working as one state, in some others not, because there are strong national interests sometimes. And in my opinion, this process will be moving forward. I am a Euro enthusiast myself. And when we talk about the discussion of the USA, this is not this stage yet, but I do not exclude it, because as a result of these huge changes, technological changes, disappearing of borders, working online, uncontrolled flow of everything, this form of traditional statehood will be changing if it turns out that because of the threat from Russia, we are integrating more our military capacities, military industry. It will turn out that this military scope does not play such a role anymore. This is a process of the development of an institution which is unprecedented in the history of humanity. I think it's one of the largest political achievements of the civilization. Today, as an enthusiast, if I were to advise the EU, I would say, I would agree with Professor, we need the vision, we need the empowerment, fight against the impossibilism, as we talk in Polish Polish politics. But we need to accept this process, and we need to have more common policies. We know that common defense policy is absolute necessity, common energy policy is necessary, common climate policy is necessary. And I think that we need to say honestly to the EU member states that when we are facing largest powers in the world, we need to have common policy towards the USA, China, India, because otherwise they can just play us out. Yes, but I will continue as to be skeptical. How to develop policy towards China? How can we find this smallest denominator with China? Because that's how you form the policy. Yes, but when we think about energy dependency from Russia, we sit down as leaders and we make an audit. Which country is mostly dependent on China? And when China faces a collision, we need to have a response to that, because if it turns out that China is making turmoil in Taiwan, and we will be afraid of the end of this trade relation, then we will say that EU is not strong enough. So we can find a lot of common denominators here. We know the history of the EU. Crises were most fruitful from the point of view of the development of the EU. Today we are facing an existential crisis because it will not make some people poorer. But today we have a threat of war which has at least a European scale. But if we add China to this, it will be a global scope. And this is why I am expecting from the leaders to build a minimum in the common policies, and then some empowerment and execution. And this is the example of anticipation strategic culture. It is not a secret that China can and will pose a threat not only for their direct neighbors, Taiwan, but also to the world, which is based on certain rules and values. And thinking of how today we are dependent on China as EU, we are much more dependent than ever before from Russia. And this transition was phenomenal in the last months when it comes to, for example, dependency in terms of gas and oil from Russia. But we cannot repeat it with China during months or years, because it will disrupt a large part of our economy. Even COVID showed it, this dependency, yes, but at the same time, European societies are expecting from the EU to be an organization that leads in the area of security. The latest surveys show that above 60% of Europeans expect the EU to provide a stronger common foreign policy and security policy. And we understand that these are areas where the development is a key for the EU. And within the following months and years, we will need to do much more together. But do you imagine an election campaign to the European Parliament next year, for example? We need more tanks in Europe, or we need more bigger military industry because we need our own ammunition. It depends on the country. In Poland, buying more tanks is a very good argument in an election campaign. Yes, but we talk about other countries. As President said, these are all processes. The first stage has already taken place. The perception of European elites has changed when it comes to what European defense is. This stage where we based our thinking on Americans coming and saving us has ended. So we used to think that there is no need to invest in military defense, but this stage has ended. So we increase our investments into the production of military equipment. And we need to know how Europe can defend itself and how we can use this huge engine that we have in NATO and in the EU, how we can use those resources to also promote our economic growth, because the point is not that we buy everything from the Americans and our European industry develops, but we need to use those huge resources for defense, and we need to use them properly. And we are almost able to convince the societies that we are not only investing in defense, we are investing in the economy, in technology, in the future of our economies. Americans are spending a lot of money on defense, and they know how to sell it to their society. This is a huge investment in terms of economy and technology, but we know that this money sometimes gets drowned unnecessarily, like, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq. But we can do it wiser, and we have to do it. And today we have the permission on the political, economic, and industrial level. And I believe that we can also convince European societies, especially those who are a bit further from the war, that this investment into defense is absolutely necessary. In order to be a strong player, you need to have the authority. Does EU have this hard power, this authority in the world? Yes, it does. It's a common market and economic power. And not so long ago, EU was a world producer of norms and standards in trade. It still is, but less than 10 years ago. It's true that for Zuckerberg, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak or Olaf Scholz are not persons to which they would bow their heads. But
firmę, no powiedzmy sobie jakąś skromną 10-miliardową grzywnę, to nie podważy oczywiście funkcjonowania firmy Alphabet czy tam innej, ale może zaboleć. Więc rzeczywiście tą hard power, tą twardą siłą jest...
They can be important for the such players, and it's the trade that is the driving force. And the problem is that we are only learning now how to use this economic power and the power of this common market to implement our goals. What are the examples?
To jest ten CBAM tak zwany, czyli carbon...
So-called CBAM.
Podatek węglowy.
The coal tax, to put it shortly. Why is it not called a tax because in order to introduce a tax, we need to have unanimity in the EU. But when we call it adjustment mechanism, we do not need this kind of agreement. And this is kind of an innovative thinking of those bureaucrats. Yes, creative laws, so to say. Yes, it's a tax, it's a kind of a fee for imported goods to the EU, whose production is related with global footprint, which is with coal footprint, which is larger than specified in the EU. Is this a protectionist activity? To some extent, yes. Nobody likes protectionism. It has negative connotations, especially in the EU, because it's against the interests of the EU as a trade power that functions very well in an open multilateral world. But if we are to defend such values as decreasing carbon footprint and protection from environment changes, but there are also other initiatives which will be forcing EU and other companies to abide by the human rights and employees' rights and to work according to the environment's interest. Well, then I do not have anything against such protectionism, because then we protect not only our internal market, but we also protect certain values. And here we have some kind of synergy, while the EU has certain values and shows them to the world and is able to use it or tries to use it. We will see how it goes. In 5 years, we will know a bit more. It tries to use it for its own purposes as well, but also for higher purposes. Yes, but we can also step on a mine. For example, this misunderstanding between USA and EU about subventions for the economy. There's a large potential for conflict here, but the interests, our common interests, should rather be to be in one boat with America.
Inflation Reduction.
I think that this Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, what a nice abbreviation. This legislation was needed to the democratic administration. This legislation had mainly other goals than fighting inflation. These were rather climate goals to a larger extent. Yes, it does make some protectionist steps directed mainly towards China and Eastern Asia, also Europe. And our goal at the moment is negotiating with America to make sure that the introduction of this IRA Act hits European interests the least. And that's how it's going on. Pedro Marquez was in the USA just yesterday. He just came here today. And he was negotiating or discussing with the representatives of the Congress and American administration on how to weaken this anti-European activity. However, still, or rather now, between the USA and Europe, there is the awareness of common interest, common values, but they do not overlap in 100%, of course. Thank you, President. Okay, I will stop being skeptical. I would like to talk about the strategic autonomy and how it can be seen in the Polish reality. We have the government as we have. Jarosław Kaczyński says the tightening European integration, extension of the EU, making it as strong as the fourth
ku wzmacnianiu jej i czy w ogóle Polska nie będzie teraz takim głównym hamulcowym takich procesów?
Z tym rządem rozmowa Unii Europejskiej jest...
Poland not going to be blocking the process. It will be difficult, obviously, because the government is partially Eurosceptical and partially against the EU. This wing of Ziobro would rather like to take us out of the EU. So when we talk about the future of the EU with such a party or coalition, it's very difficult. But let's not lose hope. This year is the election year. And we can just simply change the government and have one that will understand the EU, and we will have some vision of the EU, and will also move Poland from this EU margin, where we are due to the policy of peace, into the center, into the mainstream, because Poland deserves it. We were in this situation after we entered the EU, but on our own wish we lost this position. The slogan of the Fourth Reich and this vision distributed by Law and Justice that the EU means being submissive to the Germany. This means just taking out some historic events to scare people and to brainwash the electors. And this is not reflected in the facts, other than Germany is really a large country with the largest economy in Europe, and we cannot change it, and there are no reasons for us to demand that Germany becomes weaker, and then we will agree for deep integration. I think that policy towards Germany of Law and Justice is very destructful. It's harmful because this is our neighbor, our strong trade partner. And I speak on my behalf, on behalf of Prime Minister Belka, of Prime Minister Miller and Cimoszewicz. When we talk about Germany, which were ruled by Schroeder and other leaders, we got a lot of help from that Germany. When we were entering the EU, the Schengen zone, all of this took place thanks to German involvement. So for us, Germany as a good neighbor, good a trade partner, is much more useful than the one which we keep criticizing and accusing of all the crimes from the past. I am sure that in the reality of German elites, the responsibility for the Second World War is still present, and this should not change. But I think that this discourse, which is used by a current ruling party for the election needs, is not very useful because it brings mainly 10% of votes, but not more, because normal life is that Polish people go to Germany, they work there, Germans come. Here we do business together. Life goes on, business as usual. And I think that this is the most solid basis of Polish-German relations, irrespective of what happens in the ruling party. Yes, we have this tendency to demonize Germans and idealize Americans, and I think that we don't really know any of them, and we do not see enough how those societies are changing, and we do not draw conclusions what it means to us. For example, I'm worried about the dynamics, internal dynamics of the USA. This American isolationism. It does not come only from Donald Trump or a small group of politicians, but it results from deep social moods which turn towards these populist trends. And this is something that explains them why it's so bad and how can it be better. Unfortunately, these are trends which are very difficult to be turned back in the USA. And at the same time, there have been a lot of changes in Germany among political elites and also in the society. When we look at the level of support for the Ukraine in the society in Germany, when we look at the way this society changed their picture of Russia during the last year, this is really huge change, huge quality change. We should not perceive them through emotions and deeply rooted fears and worries, because it destroys the real picture of the situation. And because of this, we cannot work efficiently and constructively that in a way that supports our interests. And this is what worries me. Another important issue is the role of Poland. I think that this year we got a historic mandate to play a key role in Europe, and not only as an anchor of security, of transatlantic European security, but also of a country that showed itself as a humanitarian giant. I'm not talking about the government and politicians. I'm talking about the Polish citizens, of what we were capable of doing during the first weeks and months, and what we are still doing when it comes to humanitarian aid and accepting our Ukrainian guests, because we do not even use the word refugees. When it comes to integration, this is a historic change, and it will be changing Poland, not only our social tissue, but also the way that we think about ourselves and what it means to be a Polish.
So we are becoming part of the group of European countries that think more about solidarity and are more open-minded. So I'm sure that irrespective of the result of the election this autumn, this is a great opportunity for Poland to start playing a more important role in terms of European integration and transatlantic security. But there's this backlog of 7 or 8 years of the policy of the law and justice government, breaking the rule of law, inciting conflicts with the EU, and so on. This is something unprecedented in the history of the EU. So this is a ballast this is dead weight in terms of our future relations with the EU. How could Poland be a useful advocate for the Ukrainian cause, for example, as a result of these 8 years? I'm not really thinking in terms of something's for Brussels or against Brussels. Is it important for Poles? Do the Polish people want, for example, for the government to be eavesdropping on their conversations with illegal software? Do Poles want for the rule of law to be broken? Is that okay? Well, apparently it is for some. I think that's what we should be talking about. What country do we want to have in the future, and what is acceptable for us and what isn't? I think that the majority of Poles do not accept these things, and that's what we should be talking about. Now, when we talk about what people in Brussels think about us, or what people in Washington, D.C. think about this, that's not the most important thing. I think you're spot on, and it's for the voters to decide. One of the topics of the upcoming election will be about the future role and position of Poland in the EU. Now, there are two options. Either the current government, which will mean we'll be marginalized in the EU, or we want to be in the center, but then we need a new government. Now, the practicalities of the EU is that you talk to everybody. You're right about the dead weight, but we are talking about Ukraine in the EU. It's not like, if you don't start to obey the rule of law in Poland, we won't be talking about Ukraine. That's not the case. These are different things. When I think back to the very first period of the law and justice government, and there were many reasons to criticize them already. I was at a security conference in Munich, and Angela Merkel asked me, what's going on in Poland? What are the things like? And I told her, but she said, that's what democracy is like. If your majority voted for this government, then that is the government that we have to be talking to. Now, I agree with the link between rule of law and money, but there are thousands of topics being discussed in the EU every day, and it doesn't have to be connected to the rule of law, irrespective of what dead weight the government has generated. But obviously, it would be nice if the voters decided the government has to pay the bill for what they've been doing for the past 7 years. Well, my point is that we have this ethical or moral mandate right now as a result of the response to the humanitarian crisis, and this is felt in all the capital cities in Europe. We showed that without waiting for anybody else, we were able to deliver heavy weaponry in the very first weeks of the war. We helped the citizens by opening our border. I remember this tremendous feeling when we said that we are opening the border for anybody who's in Ukraine, and we are not checking their passports, we are not checking their COVID vaccinations. Well, sadly, there were some, apparently there were some problems with Indian students who wanted to get to Poland, and they were treated differently because they were not Ukrainian citizens. Well, yes, but all these problems were sorted out, and my point is we should be proud of that, and we should use this capital that we generated. And I hope that the Polish voters will be thinking not just about Europe, but also about the future of Poland. Professor, the KPO, which is the Polish program of reconstruction, the post-crisis program, as we call it, over 30 billion. What is going to happen with it? Well, the KPO is sort of an essence of what the previous speakers talked about. Some people might not even be interested with issues like rule of law, but if you realize that there are billions of zlotys to be had as part of the recovery program, that's a striking number. I don't really think that this government cares about this money right now. They will make it to the election somehow. Now, their thoughts are like this. They think that after the election, the EU just can't wait to give them the money.
Pozytywnie nastawiony.
They think that they will definitely get the money, and assuming that law and justice win the election, they will agree to sort of whitewash the rule of law problem as long as they can get the money. Now, some of the money will have been lost by then, but it'll be a smaller part of the total amount. So they're hoping they will get most of the money by just trying to whitewash the real problems. Now, the thing is, the KPO, the recovery program, is not such a huge amount as, for example, to impact our exchange rate. If you look at the forex market, at the Polish zloty, the weekly turnover is several times higher than the amount that we'll get from the KPO, the recovery program. So it's not that important financially. But the thing is, this money is for investment. You can't waste it. You can't pay it out as welfare payments or something. This is money that has to be invested, and you have to spend it on very prospective branches of the economy, like green energy or energy transition in general, the digitization of the economy, and things like that. So these are fundamental issues. Many people don't think about it, don't realize how important it is, especially in terms of digitization. So the point is, right now, given our economic situation, the actual impact of the KPO is going to be bigger and bigger. Our economic situation in Poland is getting worse. The government is running short of money, and it's not so much about lending, it's about the cost of lending, the cost of debt financing. This is more and more expensive. Now, if we manage to come to terms with the European Commission, then Poland will be considered a more predictable country with less uncertainty, also with the uncertainty from the East, and as a result, the cost of servicing the public debt would go down. Right now, the cost of servicing the public debt is going up tremendously. It's skyrocketing. Back in the day, when I was head of the National Bank of Poland, that was the good days, we paid a 10-year loan cost us about 1.3% per annum for a 10-year loan. And that was lower than some of the Eurozone countries. Today, after the rates went down already, they are now at 6.6, and they were as high as 9% at some point. And the debt is increasing, right? Our cost of servicing public debt was below 2% of our GDP. I think it was even lower than that. Right now, the current government is at over 4%. So that means that basically it's as if we are giving away about 2% of our GDP without any benefit for it. It mostly goes to foreign banks, but also to some banks here in Poland. So this is the problem. So in this respect, the KPO, the recovery plan, is very important to have, but not having it is not going to destroy the economy. Still, it's better to have it than not. Right, we have a few minutes left, and I would like to talk about things that are really interesting. Oh, thank you for commenting on what we have been saying so far. It's not being interesting. This is naturally just a joke, but Mr. President, you met Putin, you negotiated with the Russians back in the day. What is going on in their heads that in 2022 they decided that Ukraine doesn't exist, that you can conquer it in a few days? How would you explain it? Because that's the fundamental mistake they made. And that led to the whole debacle. This fundamental mistake stems from the perennial way of thinking of Russia. If you read about the history of the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, Ukraine was always considered by the Russians to be the so-called Little Russia. They have this term "chachly" about the Ukrainians, which is about sort of suggesting that they are not it's like the worst kind of a Russian person, but they still considered it to be part of their country, even though it was very contemptuous. And that's why they went on saying that, the Ukrainians are not a nation, they have no right to have their own state. Now, saying that Ukraine has no tradition of statehood is kind of duplicitous, because it's the Russians who caused the Ukrainians not to have their own state for many centuries. So the Russians prevented them from having a state, and now they are saying they didn't have a state. Now, this isn't something that Putin does. This is the DNA of all the great Russian thought. You mentioned my meetings with Putin, and it's true. It was Putin version 1 back in 2000, 2005. And I'm not talking about his doubles, of whom he apparently has many, but this is like Putin version 5.0 or something like that. But back in the day, I was in his private apartments in the Kremlin. I was back from watching the Polish national team that failed its first match in the World Cup. Right after the Polish anthem was sung, our team flopped completely. And on my way back, I was talking to Putin in Moscow. I had had 7 experience in office. He was only there for 2 years as president. And I said, what are your objectives? And he says, I want to bring back Russia's position on the international stage. And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of natural. Every president wants to do that. And then he said, and I want to reconstruct Greater Russia. He had been talking at length about the disaster that the collapse of the USSR was. He said that Gorbachev was basically a criminal who led to the collapse of the USSR. But back in the day, I assumed that this was just like a pipe dream of a young president. Greater Russia includes the Caucasus, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, and all these places. That's what Greater Russia is. So he used this word, Wielkaya Rosja, Greater Russia. So that's what we talked about. And I thought it was just a pipe dream. Now, after the Orange Revolution that I had some active participation in, and I saw what it was like, and from that point on, my relations with Putin deteriorated completely. During the anniversary of liberating Auschwitz, and then on the 9th of May in Moscow, on the anniversary of the victory, he punished us by not listing Poland as one of the allies. Yes, we still haven't recovered from that to this day. So the date is memorable, the date of the Orange Revolution, because I think he got scared. He got scared of the Maidan. For him, the biggest tragedy was that in a post-communist country, people actually might want to have democracy and dignity and a fair election. And he was afraid that this was a democratic infection that might infect Russia too. And that's why I think that after 2005, it was not just a dream to win Ukraine, to conquer Ukraine, it was a plan. After Crimea, it was no longer a plan, it's an obsession. And that's why he's a difficult partner to talk to. This is his obsession. He is not accepting rational arguments anymore. Also internally, I think, he rejects all rational arguments. So long as Putin is in power with all the enforcement structures under him, no negotiations are possible, because that's his obsession, and he thinks about the Greater Russia. Ukraine has to be his. Now, just one last comment. I've just read this article by Adam Michnik that not all Russians should be treated the same. They are not all the same. But one thing is clear. This Greater Russia way of thinking, this is not just Putin. This is, sadly, the vast majority of Russians that think like that. Well, but they thought the same in Germany in 43, 44, 45. Well, but they were occupied by the Allied forces afterwards. Now, these examples of any comparison between Germany and Russia is totally different. The reason Germany transformed was that they lost the war totally. There was a complete failure and defeat. They were occupied. The Americans created a new order in their part of Germany, and the USSR in theirs, in East Germany. So the transformation of Germany happened as a result of some very tough facts, and this can't be repeated with Russia. At the security conference in Munich, Angela Merkel said, when she thought that the end of the war would happen, and she was very good about it. She said, the end of the war will happen when your average Russian and the Russian elites understand that this war was a disastrous, historic mistake. If they finally understand that this attack on Ukraine in 2022 was unjustified and pointless and stupid, that's when this process of transformation might start. The awareness has to change first, but this is not happening right now, and I don't think it will. Yes, this vision of Greater Russia has completely distorted the ability of Russians to perceive what really is happening in Ukraine. If they were able to take a step back, they would see how Ukraine started changing after the Orange Revolution. And it wasn't because of nothing. Ukrainians started going west, coming to Poland, and they started thinking, back in the 90s, our GDP was similar to Poland's. Why is Poland so advanced now and economically strong, and they became part of NATO, part of the EU, and we're stuck with Kuchma and the oligarchs, and we're still equally poor, and it's the same people all over. So that started this process, and that speeded up after the Euromaidan in 2014, after blood was spilled. new elites emerged. Most of them are younger than me. And these elites did not agree to go to compromise about corruption, about planning the way forward for Ukraine. And naturally, the war has lasted 8 years, and that caused a lot of problems to Ukraine, and there was internal friction. But at the end of the day, a society emerged that had a very clear vision of where it wants to be at the end of the road. Now, Russia and Putin were still thinking along the pre-2014 lines, and they believed that this is a puppet government, that Ukrainians are impassive, and that if you topple Zelensky, society will once again back to Mother Russia. I'm pretty sure that a year ago, Putin didn't expect to be bombing Lviv, Kharkiv, Kherson. They didn't even think this would have to be necessary. They thought it was supposed to be a simple military operation, like a surgical special operation, just to remove Zelensky and take over power and create some sort of Russia-friendly government. And that's why it's very important to be realistic. Russians are not thinking clearly right now.
And I do not agree with this thesis that this is not the war of Putin. Unfortunately, this is the war which is supported by the whole Russian nation. And what is more, Putin needs this war. It has to be an endless war against the West, because only such a war justifies the need of his existence in the Russian politics. Therefore, for him, this war will take various forms. It cannot stop being hot like now in this format. But as long as it lasts and there are people connected with Putin, they will be carrying out this war on various fronts. They are waiting for other areas where they could carry out this war. Therefore, we need to prepare for a lot of years of confrontation with Russia. But at the same time, we need to end this hot phase of Ukrainian war, because Ukrainians do not have the capacity to carry it out more than a year. And the elections in the USA are coming, so the time plays against us, not with us. So we need to do all that is possible this year in order to help Ukraine to take over their territories from Russians. But we need to be ready that in this war against Russia, we will be in this war for decades. Yes, so one more comment, because the Russians themselves say that the system created by Putin is Putinism, and the difference, because all the special services, KGB and Putin, they have always been playing their role in the Soviet Union and earlier, but there were systems of control. The Communist Party was somehow controlling this KGB tool, and for the first time the KGB is ruling Russia, and Putin got a position, a special position here. Why am I saying this? I remember one of my discussions with the Russians when various divisions of attack on Ukraine were discussed. And we said, you said that Ukraine changed. This is a conscious nation which knows what they want. So if you have this picture that in the east of Ukraine they will welcome you with flowers, or closer to a Polish border they will just be ready for you to come, this is a mistake. They had this information, they knew it. Putinism created this system. Those intelligence structures needed to inform them about the real moods in the Ukraine, or maybe those structures are completely unprofessional now. So they created a monster, a leader who does not take into consideration any realistic evaluations, and he will be making very crazy and dangerous decisions. To end this part of our discussion, I would like to ask the professor, who will run out of money faster, Russia or the West, the EU? Obviously, Russia, since December last year, serious problems have started. This cliff effect when it comes to the budget of Russia. Sanctions are starting to work. because not only the prices of raw materials, energy materials went down drastically, but also sales to the West has decreased by 2/3, and now it's almost close to zero. And all the oil and gas that go to China, to India, they go for 1/3 of the price. Therefore, the last months have been the months of a budget deficit. Obviously, Russia has certain money resources from the good times, and that shows how competent certain elements of economic power in Russia are, and here I mean mainly the National Bank of Russia. But this money will also be finished soon. Now we say that it's only around 100 billion euros. This is not that much. Polish reserves is more than 300. So we can say that the money is decreasing, but Russia can function also with a budget deficit, but then a ruble will weaken. Why is it so strong? Because there is no import. Why else would it be weak if they're not spending any money on the import? Because the import is blocked. But they can keep financing their military efforts by printing money, and then we will have higher inflation in Russia, but it's their problem, not ours. But today, the country that wins the war is the country that has more population to sacrifice. So Putin will be using a society, and that's how he will get the money for the war. I think that he can function at least 6 more months without any serious financial disturbances. But after that, they will start falling into debt, mainly with China. The indebtedness, in a broad meaning, in Russia and China, of Russia and China, is becoming really horrendous, and Russia will probably never come out of it. Russia is really becoming weaker. Yes, and one of the successes of Putin was to decrease the debt of Russia around the year 2000, and Russia was sovereign at that time, did not have any debts towards anybody. And this time is coming to an end, and this means becoming dependent politically, in this case, from China. Yes, but it would be good if, as a result of these economic difficulties, there was a change in the Kremlin, because, well, there will be a change in the households. Yes, I am afraid that Putin will resist it, because the change in Kremlin would be a game changer, but I'm afraid it will not happen. And this factor of time is really essential. And on the side of Ukraine, it's expressed mainly in the limitations of human resources, because Putin is using soldiers, little boys from Siberia and other province towns. He did not dare do mobilization in Moscow or Petersburg. I address every person with highest respect, but I would say that the quality of this soldier is not the best. What Ukrainians have is comparable to the Warsaw Uprising. They have students, engineers, young doctors. They have people who they will not have so many anymore in the nearest future. So this is the pressure of time, because the resources of Ukraine are shrinking, the human resources. If it's to last for 2-3 years, then the problem of human resources will be key for Ukraine. Thank you very much. Now we have 15 minutes for questions from the room, so maybe 2-3 questions, but I would like to ask very young persons to ask questions. This is discrimination.
Troszkę młodszemu pokoleniu.
Let's give a chance to younger generations. So I'm waiting for questions. I will approach you with microphones. We will collect all the questions and then we will give a common response.
Mikrofonu nie przekażę.
Po tej stronie ktoś chce zadać pytanie, to ja od razu mikrofon przekażę.
I can also give the microphone, pass the microphone to the other side. Hello, I am a student here at Kazimiński Academy. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I would like to ask a question about the economic autonomy. You mentioned this topic, the president mentioned the chips and importing stuff from China, and that as the EU we should perform this audit of products imported from China. But can the EU afford such an audit? If we look at the internal goals of the EU, such as environment protection, energy transition, most of such things as solar panels or materials for windmills, they are imported from China, and the same with other raw materials. Each person who tried to buy a new car this year realized that there is 1 year of waiting period because supply chains are delayed. The EU does not produce those elements itself, and this is also about semiconductors, microchips, space technology. What about the strategy of this independence of the EU? How can it look in the future? Thank you very much. Magdalena Rybicka, Academy of Finance and Business, Vistula. I am young in spirit, and I have an essential question, and I think you are the right persons to answer it. I would like to ask about China and Russia. Is it not very dangerous for us to be somehow putting Russia under the grip of China, and then Russia will be moving closer to China because they have no other allies? Is it not going to be a larger threat for the EU and for the USA, which are still in an open dispute, so to say, with China? And is this action not going to pose a larger threat for us? Hello, Bartosz Jedliński at the Szyński Center. I have a very short question about Ukraine. In your opinion, is it not high time to withdraw the debt of public debt of Ukraine, because they're fighting for the sovereignty of their country and of Europe as well? 3 times, yes. Yes, Europe can definitely afford an audit because it's kind of an analysis of risks and dependencies. We need to know where we are mostly dependent from China and how we can free ourselves from those dependencies or make them smaller. And so this has to be done as soon as possible. And here the interests of various countries in the EU can be different. Germany is much more engaged in the trade relations with China than France, for instance. But this needs to be done, and we need to start the process of weakening those dependencies. This does not happen within a week or months, but it can develop within a few years. And for that, we also need Europe to move closer to other regions of the world. That means Africa, Latin America, because this is where we can use a replacement, so to say. Firstly, yes, obviously, we need to cancel the debt, but the problem is that they keep growing constantly. Therefore, I imagine that when the war ends, when we reach certain stability, not necessarily the end of the war, when we can start the reconstruction of Ukraine, one of the first things will be cancelling their debts. Politically, it will be much easier than cancelling the debt of Greece in 2012. In 2012, Angela Merkel was full of fear that if we cancel the debt of Greece, then Italy and Spain will queue for the same thing. But here, there will not be such a situation. And now about China and Russia. This argument that you used, that we are pushing Russia into the hands of China, this is an argument to which I have to reply, what is the alternative? If we do not do that, we need to give up on Ukraine, we need to make a deal with Russia, say this is the zone of influence here on the border with Poland, everything to the west is west and all the rest is you, and please promise us that you will not cooperate with China any further. I do not see a world where this kind of scenario could take place. At the same time, this argument about pushing Russia in the arms of China is a dangerous argument because it tells us that Russia is able to cooperate with us against China. Russia has no interest today to strategically or tactically weaken China. Russia needs China a bit less, but as much as China needs Russia. Already from Xi Jinping, there was a strategic alliance, and seeing that we cannot break it because this alliance is really based on the common interests, not values, but interests, and they are defined in a very simple way. Kill the West and create an order in which we can do whatever we want in our zones of influence with without any activity of human rights activists or EU or international law. And the further the expansion of Xi Jinping and his Communist Party is moving, the more this alliance is strengthening. This already took place, and now it's only a matter of time that China starts to provide military aid to Russia. They were waiting, they were maybe hoping that situation would develop more positively for Russia, that maybe they wouldn't have to get involved, but they see that Russia have a large chance of losing the war. And for China, this is unacceptable because they do need Russia and Putin and their regime as a strong actor in this part of Europe. So they will be helping. This alliance already exists. So talking about this is post factum. I would rather put this argument differently. The one that we used with Americans at the beginning of the war is that Chinese are looking at us and how we react to breaking international order and the rules of territorial integrity in Ukraine, and they are drawing conclusions. And therefore, if we do not react seriously in Ukraine, that tomorrow we will have Taiwan, and we will have two fronts of this war, because this is a world war. Historically, I think that this period will be described as a world war, but with different tools, because there are those conflicts in the Ukraine, in Taiwan, that they can be conventional tools, but in reality, it is a war of authoritarian countries, such as Russia, and it's a war against democracy. And the sooner we understand it, the sooner we will have some conclusions from this audit of China, because we will realize that Chinese will not only look at cooperation economically, but they will look at it as Putin in a political way. because economy does not matter if we can put political pressure. So we need to wake up and realize that we are in a different world. We will have to make decisions and choose. There is no more cooperation of everybody with everybody and where everybody loves each other. We are in the time of a battle of what Europe and the USA managed to create during those times. The closer Russia gets to China, the closer India will get to the West. Yes, one more comment, because Biden in Warsaw 1 year ago, he said that this is a war of democracy versus autocracy, and this is true. So your reasoning, Professor, is really adequate. We need to understand that this is a war. On the one hand, we have democracy with its values, and then on the other hand, we have autocracy with its values. But for sure, it's not democratic values. We had this triumph of democracy where the list of democratic countries were growing in the 90s as an avalanche, but now it's shrinking. And this autocratic model, they are trying to export it. I had a chance to visit a few African countries and their leaders as ex-president already. On the one hand, there is democracy. They chose the Chinese model because you can rule as long as you want, you can steal as much as you want without being controlled by free media or parliaments. So is this a world war? We have some doubts here. So far, it's within certain frames, but it can become a world war. But for sure, this is war between democracy and autocracy. I have no doubts about it. And I need to end because I have a plane to catch. Thank you for your patience. I don't know if that was an optimistic accent.
Ale był to na pewno mocny akcent.
But it was strong, for sure. Thank you very much. The one about the war. President Aleksander Kwaśniewski, Professor Pisarska, and Professor Marek Belka. Thank you very much.